The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 10th century, were a time marked by strict societal structures and rigid gender roles. Society was largely defined by a feudal system, and at the heart of this system was a strong patriarchal order. Men ruled over nearly every aspect of life, social, political, and economic, and women were viewed as secondary citizens, often relegated to the roles of wives, mothers, and caregivers. In such a society, women had limited rights and freedoms, and any deviation from the prescribed roles could result in severe punishment. Among the many brutal forms of punishment in medieval times, one of the most shocking was the castration of women. While castration is often associated with men particularly as a punishment for crimes, such as rebellion or criminal acts, women were also subjected to this horrific fate, though it was far rarer and often kept hidden from the public eye. The practice was deeply rooted in societal views that women were primarily valued for their reproductive ability, and any challenge to this idea was met with brutal retribution. Castration, in this sense, was seen as the ultimate punishment for any woman who defied societal norms, as it stripped her of her most valued characteristic, her ability to bear children. In medieval society, a woman's worth was defined by her capacity for reproduction and her adherence to strict social expectations. The Middle Ages were a deeply religious time, and the Church held significant power over everyday life. Women were expected to submit to male authority, whether in the form of a father, a husband, or the Church. Those who deviated from these expectations were viewed with suspicion, and any form of defiance was often seen as a challenge to the established order. Women who were accused of being too independent, too sexual, or too powerful were at risk of punishment, and castration was one of the most extreme methods used to break their spirit and enforce conformity. The origins of this punishment can be traced to the rigid gender roles that medieval society imposed on women. Women were not allowed to hold property in their own name, and their ability to participate in politics, education, and intellectual life was severely limited. They were seen primarily as objects of reproduction and were expected to produce heirs, manage the household, and fulfill the role of mother. Any deviation from these roles, whether through acts of rebellion, defiance, or perceived promiscuity, was often seen as an affront to the patriarchal order, and severe punishment was deemed necessary. The link between castration and witchcraft. One of the most horrifying and infamous reasons for which women were castrated in the Middle Ages was the widespread fear of witchcraft. During the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, Europe was consumed by witch hunts. Thousands of women were accused of practicing witchcraft, and many faced torture and execution. While the most common forms of execution were burning at the stake or drowning, some women who were accused of witchcraft were subjected to castration, particularly when their crimes were deemed to be acts of unnatural behavior. The rationale behind this extreme punishment was that women who were thought to possess magical powers were seen as a threat to religious and societal order, and their sexual organs were viewed as channels through which evil powers could manifest. The fear of witchcraft was not limited to specific regions. It was pervasive across Europe and beyond. Women accused of witchcraft often had little more than rumors or their independent behavior to fuel accusations against them. A woman who lived alone, who spoke out against the Church, or who was known for practicing herbal medicine could easily be branded a witch. Those who were considered too powerful in their sexuality or influence could also be accused of witchcraft, as the prevailing belief was that women who exercised too much freedom in these areas were likely practicing sorcery. Castration in the context of witchcraft accusations served both a physical and symbolic function. Physically, it rendered the accused woman incapable of sexual reproduction, thus eliminating the power that medieval society believed to be linked to her body. Symbolically, it was an act of disempowerment by stripping a woman of her sexuality and reproductive capabilities. Society believed it could eliminate her influence and control over the male-dominated world. Women who were seen as threats to social order, particularly those who were perceived as using their sexuality in ways that were deemed unnatural, were thus punished in the most extreme way possible: castration and adultery. Another reason women were subjected to castration in the Middle Ages was for perceived sexual transgressions, especially adultery. In a time when a woman's value was intimately tied to her chastity, any deviation from this expectation could lead to harsh punishment. Women who were caught committing adultery or engaging in sexual acts outside of marriage were often subjected to public humiliation, torture, and in extreme cases, castration. For medieval society, the act of removing a woman's reproductive organs was seen as a way of erasing her sin and purging her of her perceived corruption. Adultery was considered one of the gravest offenses a woman could commit, as it threatened the very foundation of the patriarchal family structure. A woman's role was primarily to bear children and remain faithful to her husband. Adultery, therefore, represented not just a betrayal of her husband, but also an act of rebellion against the societal order. In this context, castration was seen as the ultimate punishment for women who broke these sacred vows. By removing a woman's reproductive capacity, medieval society believed it could prevent her from ever committing such an offense again, ensuring that she would no longer be able to bear children or engage in sexual activity. The secretive nature of castration. Despite the brutality of castration, it was not always carried out publicly. In many cases, it was done in secret, hidden away from the prying eyes of society. This secrecy may have been due to the extreme nature of the punishment and the fear that it would shock the population if it were openly discussed. Women who were castrated were often isolated from the rest of society, forced to live in seclusion and stripped of their identity. The punishment was not only physically damaging, but also psychologically devastating, as it symbolically marked the woman as other, someone who had been removed from society for violating its deepest rules. This secretive nature of castration also reflects the fear that women who were deemed to be too independent or too sexual posed a threat to the social order. By carrying out such an extreme punishment in secret, medieval society sought to maintain control over women's bodies without fully exposing the extent of its cruelty to the public. Women who were castrated were often silenced, removed from history, and erased from the social landscape. The punishment of castration, though terrifyingly extreme, was not merely a method of physical mutilation. It also served as a symbol of the power dynamics at play in medieval society. As a society rooted in deeply patriarchal values, medieval Europe viewed women as secondary to men in almost every aspect of life. This gender hierarchy was reinforced through religion, law, and cultural norms. Women who defied the boundaries of this rigid gender structure were often treated with extreme violence, and castration was one of the ultimate acts of repression. In medieval times, women were largely seen as property first under the control of their fathers and later, their husbands. Their primary role was to maintain the family line by bearing children. As a result, women's bodies were frequently controlled and regulated, with their sexuality often regarded as a threat to the societal order. A woman who expressed sexual independence or whose actions deviated from the patriarchal norms could be viewed as a danger to the male-dominated structure of medieval society. This perceived threat was met with brutal retribution, and castration was often used as a method to control women's bodies and eliminate any possibility of rebellion. For many women accused of witchcraft or sexual misconduct, castration was seen as a way of purging them of their perceived evil. The idea that women who defied the established order were inherently sinful was deeply ingrained in medieval society, and castration was regarded as a form of purification. The Church, which wielded tremendous power in medieval life, justified this violence by citing religious doctrine that painted women as the weaker sex, more susceptible to temptation and sin. In this context, castration was not just a physical act. It was a symbolic removal of a woman's power. By stripping women of their reproductive capacity, society sought to reassert its control over their bodies and their lives. The psychological and social consequences of castration. The psychological toll of castration in the Middle Ages cannot be overstated. For women who were subjected to this horrific punishment, the trauma was not only physical but emotional and social as well. Women were often mutilated and then cast aside, ostracized from their communities. Castration robbed them of their primary identity as women, leaving them powerless and isolated. Beyond the physical pain and suffering, castration served as a public humiliation, a clear message to society that women who did not conform to their prescribed roles would face dire consequences. Women who were castrated were seen as other, marked for life as dangerous deviants who had to be removed from the social fabric. This social death was as significant as the physical mutilation, leaving the women who underwent this punishment without any possibility of reintegration into society. In many cases, women who were castrated were forced into exile, living in isolation away from their families and communities. They were stripped of their dignity and their identity, and their lives were often defined by this traumatic event. The social stigma attached to castration meant that these women were often regarded as outcasts, with little hope for redemption or social reintegration. The impact of this punishment also extended to the broader community. Castration was not just a punishment for the individual woman, it served as a warning to other women. It was a powerful tool used by the patriarchal system to ensure that women remained submissive and obedient. The fear of such extreme consequences kept many women in line, ensuring that they would conform to the rigid gender roles that had been set for them. The cultural legacy of castration in medieval society. While castration may seem like an isolated and extreme punishment, it was part of a broader pattern of controlling women's bodies and lives in medieval society. The practice of castration reflects the deep-rooted fear that society had of women's power, particularly their sexual power. In a time when women were largely confined to the private sphere of the home, any attempt to step outside of this prescribed role was met with punishment. Women who challenged their subjugation by participating in political life, expressing sexual autonomy, or engaging in intellectual or artistic pursuits were often labeled as threats to the established order. The fear of women who were too powerful in their sexuality, independence, or influence led to the widespread use of violent tactics to suppress them. Castration was just one of the many methods used to control women, alongside other forms of public humiliation, torture, and execution. The medieval mindset was so deeply entrenched in patriarchal beliefs that it viewed any form of female power as inherently dangerous. The cultural legacy of these practices is still felt today in many parts of the world, where women continue to be subject to various forms of control and violence. The medieval use of castration serves as a reminder of how far societies have gone to suppress women and ensure that they remain in subordinate positions. Although the practice of castrating women is no longer prevalent, the underlying cultural attitudes that justified such violence are still present in many societies today. Modern reflections and the fight for women's rights. Looking back at the horrifying practice of castration in the Middle Ages, it's clear that the control of women's bodies was a central theme in maintaining social and religious order. Women who defied the prescribed gender roles were punished severely, and castration was the ultimate symbol of this power dynamic. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, it is important to understand that the subjugation of women's bodies is not something relegated solely to the past. In many parts of the world, women continue to face violence, oppression, and control over their bodies. The fight for gender equality and women's rights has been long and hard fought, and it continues today. The legacy of practices like castration serves as a stark reminder of the importance of continuing to advocate for women's rights and freedom. Women today still face challenges to their autonomy and bodily integrity, whether through reproductive rights restrictions, gender-based violence, or societal expectations that limit their choices. As we move forward, it is crucial to continue addressing these issues and to create a world where women's bodies are no longer seen as objects to be controlled. By acknowledging the horrors of the past, we can better understand the ongoing struggles women face today and work to ensure that such abuses are never repeated. The history of castration, along with other forms of gender-based violence, serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of equality, justice, and respect for all women.